Okay, we'd like to turn to the book of Judges, chapter 7. Book of Judges, chapter 7, very familiar passage of Scripture. We'll read the first 8 verses. Then Jerubbaal, who was Gideon, and all the people that were with him, rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill Moriah in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give to the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. Now therefore go to proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whosoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned of the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Bring them down into the water, and I will try them for thee there. And it shall be, that of whom I say unto thee, this shall go with thee, the same shall go with thee. And of whomsoever I say unto thee, this shall not go with thee, the same shall not go. So he brought down the people unto the water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, every one that lappeth of the water with his tongue, as a dog lappeth, him shalt thou set by himself. Likewise every one that boweth down upon his knees to drink. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men. But all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into thine hand. And let all the other people go every man into his place. So the people took victuals in their hand, and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man into his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian was beneath him in the valley. After the death of Joshua, the nation was ruled by judges, basically military leaders. This went on for about 300 years to the ascension of Saul to the throne of Israel. The book of Judges is the recorded history of that time. The era of the judges was a time of open sin, instability, and oppression. We read in Judges 17:6 and also in Judges 21:25 concerning the time of the judges that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. In other words, people were a law to themselves. But as you read the book of Judges, you'll notice that there is a 5-fold cycle repeated 7 times throughout the book. 5-fold cycle. First, the Israelites would forget God's goodness to them, and they would begin to worship Baal. Second, God would give them into the hands of their enemies. Third, after a while, they would cry out to God for deliverance. Fourth, God would raise up a judge, a military leader, for the purpose of delivering the people. Fifth, when the judge died, they would return back to Baal worship. This fivefold cycle is how they lived. They vacillated between obedience and apostasy. And that's basically what happens in every unsurrendered life. What we see in the book of Judges is that a non-surrendered life leads to an abandonment of God's ways, which leads to the way of self, which results in a compromising of God's ways, which results in bondage. And we see that throughout the book of Judges. Now our text records how that God miraculously used Gideon. He would have been the fifth of the 15 judges. How God used Gideon and a band of 300 men to do the work of God. Our text reveals how that God reduced Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300. That is, his army was reduced to less than 1%. You can do the math. I believe it's 0.94%, maybe 0.96, but it's less than 1%. And as we consider the reduction of Gideon's army, we must not look at it as just a record of history, but it is a biblical record of instruction, admonition, encouragement, and rebuke from God's Word. Gideon and his 300 men were successful in defeating the Midianites. And in the account before us, the Lord shows us who it is that is ready, who it is that is fit for the Master's use. Our subject is the less than 1%. The less than 1%. From 32,000 to 300. Less than 1%. By way of background, leading up to our text, after Deborah and Barak had delivered the Israelites from the oppression of the Canaanites, Israel had 40 years of peace. But once again, they abandoned God, followed the false religions of the land, and now as a result they find themselves under the oppression of the Midianites, and this had been going on for 7 years. Now, the Midianites, it wasn't a country. The Midianites were basically a roving band of warlike people. They had no settled home. They just roamed from place to place. They would strip an entire country during the harvest season, drive off the cattle, drive off the sheep, sell the stolen goods to caravans of traders. So there were the Israelites, and they're now under the oppression of the Midianites. The Israelites would plant their crops, grow more fruit, raise more stock, only to have the Midianites return the next year to do the same thing, steal it all and sell it. And this has been going on for 7 years. We learn from chapter 6, verses 2 through 6, that the land was so terrorized by these Midianites that people had left their homes and were now living in dens and caves. We read in chapter 6, verse 2, "And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, Because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains, and caves, and strongholds. Verse 6, and Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. We read in chapter 6, in verses 11 and 12, that one day Gideon, he's threshing wheat in some cave, seeking to hide his produce from these Midianites. And God appeared to him and gave him assurance. He said, the Lord is with thee. The Lord is with thee. Chapter 6, verse 16, the Lord told Gideon, surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. That is, as if they were one. Acting under the direction of God, encouraged from God, Gideon took 10 men and destroyed the altar of Baal, and then built an altar unto the Lord on the same spot, and offered burnt sacrifices. And while all this was going on, the Midianites, and now also the Amalekites, were gathering their forces in the plains of Jezreel. Gideon was moved by God to sound a trumpet, to call the people together for battle. Messengers were sent throughout the tribes to announce the call to arms. These messengers were to declare that though the vast armies of the enemy were gathering in the valley to attack, that Gideon had been promised by God that they would be defeated. So their faithful response to the call was a matter of faith. That God had given this assurance to Gideon. What we learn from our text is that the great majority of God's people are not ready and are not fit for success in God's work. Paul in 2 Timothy 2, verse 21, spoke of a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, prepared for every good work. We ought to desire to be such a vessel unto honor, sanctified and meet for the master's use, and prepared unto every good work. I believe our text tells us what is required to be such a vessel. In our text, there are 5 groups of people that we want to consider in this message. And we want to, and we need to, make personal examination as to what group do we identify? To which group do we identify? First group of people, there were those who chose to ignore the call. The whole nation had been sorely oppressed for 7 years by the Midianites. 7 long years. And only 32,000 people responded to the call. The entire nation was feeling the terrible oppression of the Midianites. And yet the vast majority do not respond to the call. The promise from God to Gideon was that he would smite the Midianites as one man. That meant nothing to the vast majority. 32,000 responded to the call. That's a very small percentage of those who did not respond. Far, far, far more did not respond. Because the promise of God to Gideon meant nothing to them. Though the entire nation was suffering terribly, and though the entire nation was in a state of great distress and misery, the vast, vast majority did not respond to this call to service. They felt no need. They were not compelled to answer the call. And though the Midianites had been robbing the Israelites of their livelihood for 7 years, and though the entire nation wanted liberation from this oppression, when it came time to do something about it, the vast majority chose to stay where they were. 32,000 people responded. That's a small percentage of the whole. The vast majority refused. The vast majority stayed where they were rather than step forward for the cause at hand. To that vast majority, the call and the promise of God meant nothing to them. They were unaffected. They were untouched by the call to service. We've seen those people. They sit in churches all their life, and they've never been touched, never felt compelled, unaffected by the Word of God, unstirred, unmoved. The vast majority stayed where they were. They were oppressed, and the truth is they were content to remain so, if it meant they were going to have to do something. If it means I have to do something, I'll just stay where I am. That's their attitude. Much like today, they were living in a culture of godlessness. They were living in the chains and the snares of the enemies of God. And yet they're unmoved by the call and promise of God. And I am sure that all those who refuse to answer the call, all those who refuse to step forward in the Lord's service, had what they considered to be good reasons for doing so. I mean, every one of them. Every single one of them could give you a reason why it was okay for them to stay home. They all had their reasons. And what I found through the years is those who justify themselves in not serving God will always be able to do so. Always. Oh, Brother Dan, as soon as I retire, you can count on me. No. It's not going to happen that way. You'll have another reason. That's just the way it is. So I'm sure that all these who did not respond, in their minds they had good reasons for not doing so. Secondly, there were those who responded to the call and appeared to be ready. 32,000 of them. The call goes through the tribes that the Midianites and the Amalekites are gathering, but that Gideon had been promised by God the victorious presence of God. And among those who had been so oppressed for 7 years, 32,000 stepped forward for the cause of the Lord. These 32,000, they were willing up to a certain point to leave their families, to leave their substance, and they came willingly to meet danger. These 32,000, they were willing to sacrifice something, unlike the ones who did not respond at all. These 32,000 gathered on Mount Gilead. From outward appearance, they're brave, they're dedicated to the cause of God. But God would put their character and their faith and their integrity and their sincerity and their principles to the test, to manifest. Again, these appear to be ready, but God would put them to the test to manifest who was really ready and fit for the Master's use. In the end of these 32,000, 31,700 would prove to be unfit and unready for the Lord's service at hand, for the need of the hour. The lessons we learn here thus far is the vast majority do not answer the call. And those who do answer, only a small portion are really fit for the Master's use. You say, well, that's depressing. No, it really isn't. Thirdly, there were the 22,000 who responded to the original call but left. In verse 2, the Lord tells Gideon that the 32,000 men are too many. The reason is because Israel would think they did something to get the victory. The Lord then instructed Gideon in verse 3 to stand before these 32,000 men and say, whosoever is fearful, that is, you're feeling anxious and you're afraid, let him return and depart from that Mount Gilead. And 22,000 men, 2/3 of them, turn and go home. They just turn and go home. Though they saw and they felt that there was a cause, and though they willingly volunteered, and from outward appearance seemed serious and dedicated for the cause of the Lord, the first chance they got, they leave. They leave. And they return home. They could see the host of the Midianites encamped in the valleys. They're holding all the strategic positions. They have the people of God hemmed in. And seeing such, they became fearful. and afraid. And their fear outweighed their belief in the promise of God. And now, they're more willing to go back to their manner of living than to go forward in the cause of God. These 22,000 men, here was their problem. They had their eyes upon the task at hand rather than upon God. That was the problem. They lost focus upon the promise of God to Gideon. And as a result, the task at hand became too great. Because they lost their focus on God, the task at hand became too great. And they were fearful and afraid. And now they're willing to go back home because they have their eyes set on an apparent impossibility. They were fearful and afraid. Willing to go back home because of doubt and unbelief. They were fearful and afraid and willing to leave Gideon and the others because when it got right down to it, they thought more of their own safety and well-being than the cause at hand. They were fearful and afraid and willing to abandon the cause because in reality, their heart was back home. Yes, it appears that these are faithful individuals, but eventually it would be manifest where their heart is. And their heart was back home. In other words, they had more passion for home than the cause of the Lord. 22,000. Not ready, not fit for the Master's use. Out of 32,000, 2/3 of them, though from outward appearance, seemed to be ready to stand for the cause. They were not. They were not. And I promise you today, there is a large group of people who appear ready, but mark it down, they're not. And time will tell, always does. These individuals were more ready to quit than to stand for the cause of the Lord and go forward at the promise of God. Oh, we're ready, Gideon! But the truth is, they were more ready to quit. And I believe there are a lot of people that fall into that category. The reasons for quitting were greater than the faith in the promise of God. We need to consider, what will it take to get you and I to quit the Lord? What will it take to get you and I to quit the Lord? And here's the truth. None of us really know the answer to that question. Oh, don't think you do. None of us really know the answer to that question. Some will immediately respond, I'll lay down my life for the cause of Christ. But once again, they're not even willing to give a few hours to the Lord. They talk a good game, but it's not reality. What will it take to cause me, to cause you, to quit the Lord? Think about it. You read the history of the martyrs. It's not only many times that they were threatened with death. You deny Christ, or I'm going to kill your child. You say, well, you don't know what you would do. You have no idea. We don't know what it'll take to get us to quit. All we can do is plead the grace of God. But I'm here to tell you these 22,000 were more ready to quit than to go on. 2/3. 2/3 of those who appeared to be ready were more ready to quit. I don't believe the numbers have changed that much. I don't believe these numbers are just thrown in here to keep us interested. I believe there's lessons here. There's also the fourth group. There were the 9,700 who responded to the call but were not fit. After the 22,000 left and headed home, Gideon is left with 10,000 men. These 10,000 remained true, and they stood firm after they had personally witnessed 22,000 turn their backs and head home at the first chance they got. So you got to give them some credit. They stayed. And though these 10,000 are a very small number compared to the enemy forces, yet again, God speaks to Gideon, verse 4, and says, the people are yet too many. And God would put these 10,000 to the test to manifest who was really ready and who was really fit. God still does the same thing today. He puts people to the test and it reveals who's ready and who isn't. In time of war, you'd better make sure of the person next to you in the foxhole. And it's good to know before you got to get to the foxhole. It's just good to know. These 10,000, no doubt, had more determination. They had more willingness for the cause at hand than the 22,000. No question about that. These 10,000 were to march on their way toward the camps of the Midianites. That means they're getting closer and closer to the enemy, closer and closer to the battle at hand. And God would bring these 10,000 to some water. And Gideon is told in verse 5 that when they approached that water, some of the men would drink like a dog, lapping with their tongue. In other words, they would keep their weapons in one hand. While looking around, they would scoop their hand into the water, always alert, and lap. There would be those who would do that. And then there would be those, as soon as they saw the water, they would drop their weapons, fall down on their knees, and just drink. He says you put those two responses in two separate groups. 9,700 men, when they got to that water, they fall down on both knees, ignoring everything else to quench their thirst. 9,700 men. These individuals were careless. They were thoughtless. They lost their focus and forgot what it was all about when it came to their physical need of thirst. Forgetting everything, they just dropped to both knees and began to drink. In reality, they didn't truly realize the seriousness of the matter at hand. You might think this test is a small thing, but it's not. These men, when it came right down to it, were more interested in and more concerned about their physical needs than the cause of the Lord. You don't want to be in the foxhole with somebody who's more concerned about themselves than the cause at hand. Because when it comes right down to it, they're going to save themselves. These men allowed their personal needs to cause them to forget the main reason that they were there. The main thing ceased to be the main thing. So it is today. God's people, for the most part, the main thing has ceased to be the main thing. The main thing is not your happiness. The main thing is not your children. The main thing is not your grandchildren. The main thing is the Lord. And I'm here to tell you it's probably less than 1% when it comes right down to it that know that. Though these 9,700 men advanced further than the 22,000, in reality they weren't ready. They weren't fit for the task at hand. Though they were more willing, and yes, even more courageous, when they dropped to both knees and began to drink that water, they showed that they had too much self-indulgence for the task at hand. And that brings us to the third group, or the fifth group. There were the 300 whom God would use in a great way. Out of the 10,000, 9,700 men were sent to their tents. We read that there in Judges 7, verse 8. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you and deliver the Midianites into thine hand. Let all the other people go, every man into his place. In verse 6, there's the 300, but all the rest of the people. 300 men is all Gideon has now. Look at them. Of the original 32,000, which was quite a minority, only 300 remain. Less than 1%. Notice what the Lord said to Gideon concerning these 300 men. Verse 7. And the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you and deliver the Midianites into thy hand. He basically said, Gideon, these are the ones. These are the ones who are fit and who are ready for my use. These are the ones that I will use for my glory. But again, notice that there are the 300 and all the other people. That's the 9,700. The 300 and all the rest. A remnant of 300. Oh, to be numbered with these. These 300 had personally witnessed only 32,000 people respond to the call. You imagine 32,000 respond. It had to come up. Where's so-and-so? Well, he had to take his kid to school. Where's so-and-so? And on it went. The truth is, there was only a small amount of cared. So it is today. These 300 had personally witnessed, again, a small group of people respond. And of that small group, they witnessed that 32,000 dwindle down to 300. They personally witnessed 31,700 men go home. They personally witnessed it. But that didn't divert them. These 300 personally witnessed those who were truly fit reduced down to less than 1%. And they still are compelled to continue on. Well, 31,700 went home. But we're going to continue on. These 300 men were more willing and more burdened about the cause than the others. Again, verse 7, there are the 300, and there are all the other people. We don't want to be numbered with all the other people. We want to be numbered with the 300. Well, everybody else. You don't want to be numbered with everybody else. You want to be numbered with the 300. Not all the other people. These 300 were more affected by the cause than all the other people. These 300, no doubt, were men of faith and assurance and confidence that God was able. They viewed the cause of God greater than all else. And more importantly, they viewed the God of the cause greater than the cause. That's what will keep you going. That's how you continue on. Your heart can't be back home. Your heart can't be in the world. Your heart has to be totally set upon the Lord. They viewed the cause of God greater than all other causes. They were men of conviction. They were men of resolve, determination. They were men of courage and commitment. How willing or what will it take to get us to quit? Well, that depends on our degree of commitment. And our degree of commitment will be tested through the years. I've seen people quit church over the silliest things. I've seen people quit God over the silliest things. And all it reveals is they had very little commitment to begin with. That's what it reveals. If someone so upsets you that it keeps you from church, what does that say about your commitment? That you're willing to let one person who hurts your feelings keep you from serving God. What's that say? Nothing good. Nothing good. These 300 were men of devotion, loyalty, and passion. Loyalty to God. Loyalty will be tested. Passion will be tested. These 300 saw a cause greater than themselves. Something greater than themselves, greater than their own lives. That percentage is, in this case, was less than 1%. And I don't believe it's changed. I'm not saying there's less than 1% in this building that are willing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you take all those who appear to be ready, and when it gets right down to it, and I'm not talking about this building, I'm talking about God's people as a whole. There's probably less than 1% that really are. You say, well, that's so depressing. No, because God can use that less than 1%. Don't get your eyes on the less than 1%. Get your eyes on God. They were men who were consumed with the Lord. And they saw God as the purpose of their life. In the face of a powerful enemy, an imposing force, in the face of mighty barriers and difficulties, these 300 put self aside and surrendered to the will of God. That needs to be us. Don't worry about all the rest. Be a part of this remnant. 300 were willing to put God and God's cause ahead of all their personal wants and needs. They were determined to go all the way with God. You and I have no idea what we will face in this life. I have no idea. But I'll tell you this. It'll be easier to face it with God than without Him. Don't quit God. Well, however fierce the storm might be, I'd rather be in the storm with God than the other alternative. Be determined. I'm going to go all the way. But realize I can't do it myself. I'm not strong enough. I need God. And you plead for grace and strength every single day. Of the 32,000, these 300 were the less than 1%. Thank God for such a number. Yes, it's a small number. But thank God for that small number. Pray for the remnant. Pray for that small number. That God would give them the faith. That God would give them the strength to go on. And oh, how we ought to want to be a part of the 300 and all the other people. And all the other people. So examine our lives. With whom do we identify? The vast majority who ignore the Lord's call to service. The 22,000 who can see the calls of God, but in reality are more willing to go back to the status quo than to go forward at the risk of their own personal good. The 9,700 who can see a cause, and they go a little further than the 22,000. But when it gets right down to it, they are more concerned with their personal needs than the cause at hand, or the 300. These are the ones that God used in a mighty way. These are the ones that experienced victory. You think of all those that did not respond to the call, they benefited from what God did with these 300. You don't know who's going to benefit by your faithfulness to God. It may be somebody that's not even born yet. But there's benefits. These 300 witnessed the power of God. And all this would do would give them more courage for the next battle. These 300 experienced great joy. The 32,000 didn't, or the 31,700 didn't, but these 300 did. The world is selfish, worldly minded. And the way to rise above it all is to be surrendered to God. And that's what these 300 were. The only way to be ready, the only way to be fit for the Master's use is to be surrendered to God. We are reminded, in closing, in our text, and we need to be reminded every day, that what matters in God's service and what matters in being ready and fit for the Master's use is not numbers. It's not numbers. It's not human might. It's not human ability. But what makes the difference is complete surrender to God. We are a small number that make up this body of Christ. But this ought to be our desire, that though we are a small number that makes up this body, that everyone in this body is a part of that less than 1%. And if that's so, you're more than a church that has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. All that every one of us would be that less than 1%. God uses that group of people in a mighty way. Never get focused on numbers. Because when you do that, you begin to think, well, if we're going to keep this family, we've got to do this. You just let them go. Just let them go. In order to bring this family in, we've got to do this. Just don't worry about it. You let the Lord do the adding. And you just pray and pray and pray, Lord, make each one of us the less than 1%. That's what we want. That's what we desire. God help us that we might identify with these 300. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us in